an NVA soldier and his son hid in the jungle for 40 years. 1972 to 2013. The Vietnam War lasted for a total of 20 years, officially coming to an end in 1975. But for so many, the war continued for long after that, in the form of the severe trauma and horrific life-changing injuries that they had suffered in the conflict. Though incredibly for one man, his Vietnam War would continue for 40 years. In 2013, towards the north of the country, a shabby-looking middle-aged man in a loincloth emerged from the jungle. He was accompanied by a frail old man in ragged clothes. Both were severely malnourished with badly rotting teeth. The pair said that they were father and son who had been hiding in the jungle from the horrors of the Vietnam War for the last 4 decades. Neither realizing that the war they had fled from finished just a couple of years after they had gone into the jungle to hide. The locals were stunned to find out that the elderly man was named Ho Van Ton, a North Vietnamese soldier who was presumed killed alongside his family after his home in Quang Ngai province took a direct hit during an American air raid back in 1972. In fact, during the air raid, Ton had managed to escape deep into the jungle with his 1-year-old son, Long. At this stage, it's thought that he was already mentally unbalanced, as he had a known history of suffering from mental health issues. He stayed hidden in the jungle, fearful of further American air attacks. In a way, he had every right to be scared, for throughout the course of the war, the United States would drop over 4.5 million tons of bombs in Vietnam, resulting in the deaths of between 50 and 150,000 North Vietnamese combatants and civilians. This staggering level of ordnance that greatly exceeded what the Americans had dropped during the whole of World War II was intended to cripple the NVA's ability to wage war, and was largely attributed to the infamous Operation Rolling Thunder and Operation Linebacker. For Ton and his young son, home became an incredibly small 7-square-foot wooden tree hut with a simple thatched roof. It was constructed nearly 20 feet up in a tall tree in a remote part of the jungle that resided at the foot of a secluded mountain. So for the next 40 years, they survived only on what food they could forage from the jungle, like wild berries and cassava, which is a vegetable that, if not prepared and cooked properly, is highly poisonous and toxic. For meat, they hunted small animals, mostly mice and rats. After a few years, they even started to grow their own crops on a small patch of land that they had cultivated next to their tree hut. Their only visitor during this time was a mysterious stranger who would visit them occasionally, bringing with him gifts such as salt, kerosene, and knives. In time, both Ton and his son came to trust this kind stranger. Nevertheless, despite his pleading, they refused to be coaxed back into society. The years of intense isolation had caused them both to develop severe mental issues, resulting in Ton and Long possessing a deep mistrust and irrational fear of the outside world. They were also convinced it was still an unsafe place where the horrors of the Vietnam War were ongoing. Over the years, some of the locals also tried to befriend them, but whenever they attempted to visit Ton and his son, they would hide until the strangers had left. A few more years went by before the mysterious traveler finally revealed that he was in fact Ho Van Thi, Ton's other son who he had presumed dead all those years ago in the American bombing raid on his village. Thi was eventually able to persuade both men who were now in failing health to return to their village and once again be part of the outside world. By now, Ton was in his early 80s and his son was in his 40s. Both men struggled to adapt to their new life, despite the Vietnamese government giving them preferential treatment, counting them as war veterans and generously providing them both with a new home and a military pension. The truth was, both men missed the solitude of the jungle and would visit it regularly. For the world that Ton had returned to had changed for him beyond recognition. Vietnam was no longer a divided country. Their one-time ally, the Soviet Union, was no more, and their feared enemy, the Americans, were now involved in a bloody war in the Middle East. For Ton's son, Long, it was even worse, for he had no formal education and could neither read nor write. He could also barely speak, knowing only how to say a few words of the regional core language, and as for women, they were a complete mystery to him, as he had never seen or met one. For Long, this new world was unbearably noisy and far too overcrowded. Unsurprisingly, he was completely overwhelmed and intimidated by technology, with everyday life largely revolving around the use of high-tech smartphones and the marvel that was the home computer, both of which Long was clueless about. He would eventually return to the jungle to run a small farm, living a simple life growing rice and sugarcane. It was claimed that Tan and Long's tree hut was burnt by relatives in order to stop it becoming a tourist attraction as news of the story spread. Tan eventually died of old age in 2017. As for Long, he never quite got over his father's death, and in September 2021 died of liver cancer. He was 52 and died without ever having married or bore children. Interestingly, the story has become distorted over the years by conflicting accounts, rumor, and sensationalism. Some accounts claim that Tan's family were actually the victims of a landmine rather than a U.S. bomb. Others claim that Tan was a member of the Viet Cong, not the NVA, and that he had fled into the jungle after strangling his wife due to having a mental breakdown, taking with him their baby son. Whatever the truth may be, the story of Tan and Long serves as a sobering reminder of the extreme lengths people will take to avoid the horrors of war and the prolonged impact it leaves on the lives of forgotten survivors.
Japanese soldiers fighting on after World War II. In 1945, the Second World War was finally drawing to a close. Hitler's last stand had taken place in his bunker on April 30th, when he and his wife Eva Braun had committed suicide after it became apparent that there was no way out, and the German Third Reich formally surrendered on May 7, 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had each an atomic bomb dropped on them, forcing the formal Japanese surrender on August 15th, announced by Emperor Hirohito, and 2 weeks later on September 2nd, the war was officially over. Despite hostilities finally coming to an end, it seems that not everyone got the message. Some Japanese soldiers held out into the 1950s, 60s, and 70s for a mixture of reasons. Some had been sent to remote Pacific islands, and communication had simply been lost with the outside world, and so they missed the broadcasts that the war had ended. Others doubted the legitimacy of Japan's surrender, and others still just simply refused to believe it was all over. Japanese soldiers were trained in using the Bushido Code fighting ethic. They were taught that every fight was to the death, and that it was an honor to die for the emperor. But to surrender was both shameful and dishonorable. Because of this belief, they could not accept that their leaders would have given in and surrendered. That's why only a small percentage of Japanese soldiers surrendered during the war, whilst the majority were either captured, wounded, or killed. And why, decades later, there were still some Japanese holdouts fighting a war that no longer existed. Two of the first holdouts discovered in the 1950s were Private First Class Yuichi Akatsu and Corporal Shoichi Shimada, who had remained on Lubang Island in the Philippines, with a group led by Second Lieutenant Hiro Onoda, with orders to slow down the enemy forces by any means possible. By the time the Allies took the island on February 28, 1945, only Onoda and 3 other men remained alive, and so they retreated, hiding deep in the jungle and waging guerrilla tactics on the locals for supplies. After the end of the war and over the next 5 years, the Allies repeatedly dropped pamphlets in the jungle for the holdouts to find, detailing the end of the war. The men examined the pamphlets and deemed them fake. But in 1949, Yuichi Akatsu walked away from the other 3 men. He continued to live alone for another 6 months before surrendering to the village of Lok in March 1950. 2 years later, in 1952, the Allies dropped another series of letters and family photos across the jungle. But the 3 remaining men ignored them, still convinced it was a trick. A year later, Private Shimada was shot in the leg during a guerrilla raid. Despite Onoda successfully nursing him back to health, Shimada died in 1954, this time shot by a search party that had gone into the jungle looking for the 3 men. The other 2 soldiers continued to hide out in the jungle until the 1970s. But there were more holdouts elsewhere. In June 1944, over a year before the war ended, 3 Japanese transport ships were bombed by the Americans. About 30 survivors of the wreckage managed to swim to safety to the nearby island of Anatahan, which was part of the Mariana chain of islands off the coast of the Philippines. Later in 1944, the U.S. successfully invaded the Mariana Islands, ignoring the smaller parts of the archipelago like Anatahan, seizing the main islands in the chain. They had no idea of the Japanese residing there until the natives on nearby islands informed them. Anatahan was a small volcanic island and had very few native residents. The 30 Japanese who reached it struggled to survive, eating a diet of coconuts, insects, bats, and lizards to get by. Their conditions improved slightly after an American B-29 Superfortress bomber experienced difficulty and crashed on the island, providing the castaways with vital resources and tools so that they were able to build shelters. After Japan had surrendered, the Americans attempted to evacuate Mariana, taking 45 residents and 2 Japanese from Anatahan. But the 30 shipwreck victims refused to believe the war was over, fleeing further inland where they continued to live for another 6 years as holdouts. Among the Japanese already living and working on the island were a married couple, Shoichi and Kazuko Higa. Shoichi had left the island before all this happened to visit his sick sister on another island, but was unable to return. With 1 woman and 30 men on an island, you can probably imagine the kind of tension that arose. Kazuko pretended to be married to another Japanese plantation worker with the same surname of Higa for her own protection. But her new husband didn't last too long after he mysteriously drowned, and then the men turned on each other for a chance for her affections. Over the next 6 years, they foraged and fought for survival and spent a lot of their time drunk, having discovered a way to ferment a drink known as tuba or coconut wine, leading to violent fights and jealous rivalries that resulted in 12 of the original 30 dying on the island. As the only woman, Higa had to be smart to protect herself against the drunk and aggressive men she found herself stranded with. So she often stuck close to 4 of the men in particular, sparking jealousy in the rest as she hid behind them to fend off unwanted advances. Finally, in 1950, Higa saw a U.S. vessel off the coast and raced to flag it down, asking to be taken off the island, therefore ending her nightmare as a holdout. Through her, the U.S. and Japanese authorities learnt of the forgotten men on the island, who still did not believe that Japan had surrendered. The authorities asked their families to write letters as proof that the war was truly over. They were dropped on Anatahan in 1951, along with an official message from the governor of Kanagawa Prefecture. The holdouts were finally convinced. Waving white flags on the beach in surrender, they waited for U.S. officials to collect them from the island and send them back home. Their story became a huge sensation in Japan, and Kazuko Higa became an actress but was forever painted as the temptress seductress of Anatahan Island, and was eventually forced to go into hiding. Meanwhile, on another Mariana Island, Tinian, another Japanese holdout remained, Murata Susumu. In 1944, one of the larger Pacific Island battles of World War II took place, the Battle of Tinian. The fighting went on for 9 days before the U.S. ultimately declared victory, and a few hundred remaining Japanese soldiers fled deep into Tinian's jungles to avoid capture and surrender. These soldiers were slowly weeded out over the coming months, with the final garrison surrendering on August 4, 1945, after the war was over. But one man remained, Murata Susumu. He had set up a shack on Tinian's coast and continued to live in isolation there for the next 8 years, before he was finally captured in 1953. 2 years later, another Japanese holdout was discovered on the Philippines' largest island, Luzon. Seaman Noboru Kinoshita was one of many forgotten Japanese servicemen hiding themselves away in the island's jungles. He had fled there in 1944 after surviving the sinking of a troop ship, and then spent the next 11 years living off lizards, frogs, fruits, and wild monkeys in the jungle, unaware that the war was over. He was finally discovered in November 1955 when he was picked up by Philippines police during his raid on a jungle-side sweet potato patch, and he expected to be executed for theft. Upon finding out his enemy planned to send him back to Japan a free man instead, he hanged himself rather than face the shame of returning home. That same year, in 1955 in Dutch New Guinea, 4 Japanese airmen surrendered a whole decade after the end of the war. The Japanese had invaded Dutch New Guinea in 1942, afterwards leaving behind troops to maintain control of the island. The 4 airmen were part of a larger battalion who marched from Wewak to Hollandia in 1944. 89 men set out on the forced march, but 30 of them drowned trying to cross a storm-swollen river, and others died from hunger and disease. When the remaining men discovered the Allies had taken Hollandia, they decided to hide in the jungle until Japanese forces recaptured the land. Later, they were discovered and attacked. 5 fled deeper into the jungle, crossing the border into Dutch New Guinea and becoming self-sufficient off the land there. Due to their poor diets and lack of resources, one of the 5 died of malaria in 1947. The other 4 continued to live on in the jungle for another 8 years before being discovered by a villager from a nearby settlement. Despite learning that the war was over and that the US and Japan were now friends, the airmen refused to believe it, but stayed in touch with the villagers nonetheless. It was 3 years later that the locals and police finally convinced the airmen that the war was over, and they, at long last, surrendered themselves. In 1956, 13 more Japanese soldiers were discovered on the islands of Morotai and Mindoro. Both islands had experienced Pacific battles during the war, and many Japanese had fled into the jungles to hide. The Allies had no interest in wasting resources on these stragglers, and so some lived there for years after the war, unseen and forgotten about. On Morotai, 9 soldiers were found in 1956, and on Mindoro, 4 men surrendered in November of the same year. The Morotai and Mindoro holdouts marked the end of those discovered in the 1950s, but over subsequent decades, many more Japanese were discovered, with the final 2 holdouts surrendering in 1974, almost 30 years after the end of the war.
Hiro Onoda, the Japanese soldier who didn't surrender until 1974. Hiro Onoda was a Japanese intelligence officer in the Imperial Japanese Army who refused to surrender until decades after World War II had ended. In the Pacific Theater, there were many Japanese holdouts holding Zanryu Nipponhei, or remaining Japanese soldiers. They were motivated to continue on after the surrender of Japan in August 1945 because of their dogmatic, militaristic indoctrination, or simply because they were unaware of the surrender. Hiro Onoda was trained at the Nakano School as an intelligence officer, where he was taught guerrilla warfare and intelligence gathering. Onoda was sent to Lubang Island near Luzon in the Philippines in late 1944, where he would soon meet up with a group of other Japanese soldiers already on the island. Mijiyoshimi Taniguchi had given him orders to live off the land and forbade him to die by his own hand. He would further reassure Officer Onoda by saying, "It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. Until then, so long as you have 1 soldier, you are to continue to lead them." Higher-ranked officers in the group made Onoda unable to carry out his mission to sabotage the enemy airstrip and pier at the harbor. This in turn made the U.S. conquest of the island, which was achieved in February 1945, easy. Once U.S. forces were on the island, the large group split up into smaller groups of 3 to 4 men and escaped into the jungle, and were either picked off by the U.S. troops or surrendered until it was just Hiro Onoda and 3 others under his command which were left active. Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, all of which had set up base in the mountains. After Japan had formally surrendered in September 1945, Onoda and his group came across a number of leaflets. The first leaflet, left behind by locals, was discovered quite soon, reading, "The war ended on August 15th, come down from the mountain." However, they concluded that it was an Allied propaganda trick. After this conclusion, the group continued to raid local islanders for food and other resources. General Tomoyuki Yamashita of the 14th Area Army also dropped leaflets from the air with a surrender order, but again the group decided that they were a trick. With a lack of knowledge of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it may have seemed more unlikely that Japan was willing to surrender. In 1949, Yuichi Akatsu escaped from the group and surrendered to Filipino forces in 1950, causing the remaining 3 to be cautious to disloyalty. In 1952, the search mission was expanded with letters and pictures from the group's families dropped from an aircraft, but again, this was wrote off as a trick by the 3 soldiers. Every piece of evidence the group came across increased their paranoia and hostilities. While they were dressed in their Imperial Japanese uniforms, the people they came across were in civilian clothing, which they interpreted as Allied soldiers in disguise, with the strategy of luring them out. As a result, they didn't think twice when firing on the locals. Corporal Shoichi Shimada was shot in the leg but recovered with the help of Onoda in 1953. But on May 7, 1954, he was killed by a search party when he fired upon his potential rescuers who returned fire on a beach at Gontan. Now just 2 remained. Onoda and Kozuka would continue the mission to sabotage, gather intelligence on, and attack the enemy, which no longer existed. But on October 19, 1972, during a skirmish, Kozuka was shot and killed by the police when he was burning a farmer's rice collection. Lieutenant Onoda was now alone. On February 20th, 1974, a determined Japanese explorer called Norio Suzuki found Onoda. Onoda still refused to surrender. However, Suzuki had the idea to locate his original commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. In March 1974, his former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, traveled to the Philippines to fulfill his promise to return and end his orders in person. Onoda, still wearing his tattered army uniform from decades ago, saluted the Japanese flag and handed over his samurai sword, his functioning Arisaka Type 99 rifle, several rounds of ammunition, hand grenades, and his family dagger. The Philippine government under President Ferdinand Marcos granted him a pardon, taking into consideration that although he had killed 30 innocent people during his campaign on the island, he thought the war was still carrying on. When he returned to Japan, Onoda was very popular, but he found it hard to adjust to the new post-war Japan and the decay of its traditional values. He published an autobiography and in 1975 left Japan for Brazil, where he raised cattle and later opened a series of training schools. In his last years, Hiro Onoda said in an interview, "Every Japanese soldier was prepared for death, but as an intelligence officer, I was ordered to conduct guerrilla warfare and not to die. I became an officer and I received an order. If I could not carry it out, I would feel shame. I am very competitive." The werewolf holdouts, last-ditch Nazi resistance, World War II. In 1944, there was a widespread realization among the Nazi leadership that they could actually lose the war. Then on June 6th of that year, their worst fears came true when the Allies successfully landed a massive invasion force at Normandy in northern France and threatened to retake occupied Europe. The Nazi leadership quickly started to fall apart after that point, and there was even a serious attempt on July 20th, 1944 to assassinate Hitler with a bomb at his Wolf Lair headquarters in East Prussia. Hitler and his senior officials were looking for a last resort to keep Nazi ideology alive and turned to the supernatural for inspiration. The Germans proceeded to put a contingency plan into place, codenamed Operation Werewolf. The idea was to create a covert resistance force to continue the Nazi struggle as the Allies advanced through Germany. The strategy was not so much to win the war by guerrilla fighting, but to hold out long enough for a political settlement more favorable to Germany. Werewolves and wolves were used as symbols of German strength against those seeking to destroy them. The movement was designed to be decentralized and was mainly overseen by regional security officials. This was partly a reaction to the military bombardment under which Germany found itself. Decentralization would allow groups to operate independently should any part of the network fail. Towards the end of that year, Heinrich Himmler, who was head of the feared Waffen-SS, had recruited one of his most senior officers, a Nazi fanatic called Hans-Adolf Preutzmann, to set up, train, and coordinate the new werewolf units. These elite groups of volunteers were to be trained in guerrilla warfare tactics, sniping, sabotage, assassination, and fashioning improvised explosives. They were ordered to sabotage, commit acts of terrorism, suppress German collaboration, and generally make life as difficult as possible for the occupying Allies. They were supposed to be provided with the latest specialized equipment like suppressed pistols, fireproof coats, and high-tech sniper rifles to carry out these missions. But the werewolf units never saw their full realization, as Nazi Germany fell into total disarray from the constant Allied aerial bombing. This had caused severe equipment shortages, as Germany's industrial base was almost completely destroyed. By the end of 1944, Preutzmann had only gathered about 5,000 fighters. Nevertheless, by early 1945, several hundred recruits had been trained at the Werewolf's chief training camp at the medieval Hohlkrath Castle near Erkelenz in Germany. Most of these recruits were drawn from the Hitler Youth. One of the few wartime missions carried out by members of the Werewolf organization was Operation Carnival on March 20, 1945. During this mission, a werewolf unit parachuted into a Belgian forest on the Dutch-Belgian border outside of the German city of Aachen, using a captured Luftwaffe-operated U.S. Army B-17 Flying Fortress bomber. Their target for assassination was the Allied-appointed mayor of Aachen, Franz Oppenhoff, who the Nazis considered to be a traitor. They used intelligence to discover Oppenhoff's whereabouts and successfully assassinated him on March 25, 1945. In fact, he was killed by an SS unit which was composed of werewolf trainees from Hohlkrath Castle. One of the 6-person team was Issa Hirsch, who was a League of German Maidens girl and a captain. She was chosen because she would arouse less suspicion as Allied patrols were looking for military-aged men wandering around. The werewolf unit pretended to be German pilots who were looking for the front lines. As Oppenhoff persuaded them to surrender, they shouted "Heil Hitler!" and shot Oppenhoff in the head. One of the assassins was killed, and Hirsch was injured afterwards when they triggered a landmine while fleeing through a nearby forest. The landmine was likely placed by the German army. The rest of the werewolf unit escaped into the countryside. A small group of SS Werewolf staff were able to make their way into the Alps after the surrender, where they joined forces with a few soldiers and attempted to make a last stand. The makeshift unit was beset with problems, bad weather, breakdowns, and unsurprisingly, desertions, and was finally defeated by US forces. Much was made of the propaganda value of these so-called werewolf units, with German newspapers running sensational and mostly fictitious headlines such as "Fury of Nazi werewolves to be unleashed on invaders." Lieutenant Otto Skorzeny, a commando specialist and holder of the Knight's Cross, was later brought in to oversee training and further development of the werewolf units. Jürgen Stroop, famous for crushing the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943, was also asked to consult. They were stunned to find out that the number of werewolf cells had been greatly exaggerated, and those few units in existence were highly disorganized. Even the secret supply dumps buried around the country were not properly recorded, so few of the units knew where any of them actually were. The explosives, ammunition, and weapons had been buried in 1939, but by 1945 no one knew their location, and the advancing Soviets discovered most of them. Skorzeny then turned the efforts of Operation Werewolf towards establishing a Nazi underground railroad, which allowed thousands of SS officers to travel along escape routes called rat lines and flee. On March 23, 1945, Joseph Goebbels, the Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, gave a speech known as the Werewolf Speech, in which he said it was every German's duty to fight to the death. Then on April 1st, Radio Werewolf started broadcasting from a small town in eastern Germany, and its message was simple: resist the Allied invaders by whatever means possible. It began each program with a howling wolf sound and a song with the words, "My werewolf teeth bite the enemy." The radio station was on the air for only a matter of weeks, but it enthusiastically claimed several high-ranking Allied officers had been successfully assassinated by werewolf units, including Major General Maurice Rose, commander of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, and British Major John Poston, liaison officer of Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. In fact, both of these deaths were actually due to being in combat against German regular army units. In early April 1945, Goebbels' top aide, a Nazi called Werner Naumann, sent out a long and rambling message to the heads of all major propaganda offices across Germany. He called on them to encourage the German people to prepare and continue fighting beyond the end of the war. All of this created the illusion of an organized and dedicated Nazi secret resistance, so much so that the Allies took the threat seriously. Operation Werewolf was highly effective in its psychological impact that it had on the Allies and on German civilians. Hitler had committed suicide by shooting himself on April 30th, 1945, in his Führerbunker in Berlin. But for a while, every act of sabotage, mysterious accident, or misfortune that befell the Allied occupiers in Germany after the war ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, was credited to the werewolves. For a long time, Allied commanders had been concerned that they would face a wide-scale German insurgency and were terrified they were going to become embroiled in a partisan war that could drag out for years. Rumors concerning Operation Werewolf played directly into this fear. Allied propaganda meant that for the first few months of the occupation, there was a strict policy of non-fraternization with German citizens. Resistors were often shot or hanged, and it was believed that any German showing their right ear in an ID card photo was a secret wolf. Even local groups who offered to assist in the hunt for Nazis were not above suspicion. Strict regulations were placed on the German population, curfews were established, and it was made illegal to own firearms. By some estimates, between 3,000 to 5,000 German civilians and soldiers lost their lives in Allied reprisals out of fear of werewolf units. This fear eventually subsided, as the werewolf threat seemed to simply fade away, as the danger of the Nazis continuing an armed struggle never really materialized. Ultimately, the werewolf's propaganda value ended up far outweighing its actual achievements. In fact, the damage done was mostly to the German citizenry. since historians estimate that several thousand deaths resulted from the werewolf campaigns because they targeted all those who welcomed the Allies. A few other groups of werewolves were able to hold out until 1947, but for the most part they were limited to slogan painting and acts of sabotage. After the war, the Allies carried out a highly successful policy of denazification, which was designed to eradicate all the symbols, political organizations, and figureheads that had been created to support the Nazi culture from German society. Then the new rising danger was the Soviet Union and its allies. Rather than continue to fight against the occupying forces of Great Britain, the United States, and France, the German people were more concerned in dealing with this new impending threat. So soon, the West German countryside would be full of large packs of leopards with roaming lynxes flying overhead and cobras hiding in every hedgerow in an attempt to deter any attack by the Soviet Union.
We've got something amazing to share with you all. Thanks to our supporters in our growing Patreon army, we've been able to produce a bonus chapter for our video World War II guns still being used today. This new chapter focuses on the M4 Sherman tank, and we can't wait for you guys to see it. You can watch it now on our Patreon without ads, unrestricted and uncensored, as well as our entire exclusive Patreon library. Find the link in the pinned comment. Let us know your thoughts below.